And we're back to learning to code, and this time I'm going to walk you through the third part of the freecodecamp curriculum. As always, go through it yourself and refer to this walkthrough when you get stuck. You'll find a link to it in the description below. It's this one under new responsive web design. Third one is for the set of colored markers. We've got 94 steps in total. Let's dive right in. Here's our end result. So we're going to create these markers. And it's going to teach us a little bit of using color in CSS. But at first, we're going to create the basic structure of our website, and we need HTML for that. So let us start with the doc type, then HTML. And we already have our first attribute. We're going to add a language, which is English, to this HTML. Alright, okay, I've got a little bit of a typo here, so let me add the E, and we'll move on. Sometimes it's a good idea to just copy paste, so that you don't make these typos as I just did. Let us add a head and a body in step 2. You already know this from our first walkthrough. The head is for the meta information, the body is the stuff that you can see in the browser later on. For now, nothing has any content. We're going to add the first in step number 3, and this is the title. It belongs to the head. And the text is this, colored markers. Let me put it right here. Step 4, we need to define the charset, and we'll use the meta tag within the head for that. Charset is usually UDF-8. Don't forget, meta tags are self-closing. And again, a little bit of a typo here. Step number 5, we're going to add another meta information, and this is for the display. So let us add the name viewport, and then the content is this. So the width should be equal to the device width, and the initial scale is 1.0. And this makes this window get automatically adjusted depending on the device that is used. So this is usually the code line that you need to make your website responsive, so that it gets automatically adjusted when you, for example, use a smartphone or tablet to view it. Now our first element within the body is needed. It's an H1. And this is the first stuff that we can actually see in our browser window on the right hand side. Step 7, we now have our styles.css on top right here. For now it doesn't contain any information, but we'll need to link our index.html to it. And we'll use the link tag for that. The relation is style sheet, which is always the same. And the href needs the correct address, and this is in this case styles.css. So that's simply the name of the file that we're going to use. Don't forget to close the link tag, it's self-closing, and let me give you an example right away if I make this red. So it works. We have successfully linked the styles to the index. Let's move on. And we are in our styles.css to give it our first CSS information. We're going to target the H1. We'll use text align as a property and give it the value center, and this puts our H1 in center. So our H1 was the CSS color markers right here. Step 9. We're going to add a div element, which is basically a container. We're going to directly give it a class container. It has a closing tag, so don't forget that. And we should add it right below our h1. For now you can't see anything as our div doesn't contain information. We'll add another div inside of it and give it a class marker. So the marker div is going to be nested in a container div. And again, you won't see anything changing in the browser window for now. Step 11. We're back in our styles.css. And now we're going to target our class marker and give it a background color, in this case red. The way to write it is we'll use a dot and then the class name, which is marker, then our property and the value for it. And again, we don't see anything for now, just because our div doesn't contain information and by default it has a size that makes it invisible. But if I add, for example, a p element, you can now see it. This is our marker div. Then let's move on to step 12. And here it explains it. So the div, it doesn't have any height by default, so this value is 0 when you just have a div without content. Let's change width and height according to what we are supposed to do in this task. It's 200 for the width and 25 for the height. And now we can finally see it. So again, our div doesn't contain information inside of the HTML, but thanks to the styling here in styles, we can now see it as a block. We now want to center it, and we can use the margin property for it. We've got 4 directions, so top, right, bottom, left. And we can target them all at once by just using margin and setting it to auto. So all 4 directions will now be given the value auto. And this puts our div with the class marker in center. Let us move on to step 14. Let's add 2 more markers. We can simply copy this code line in our index.html and paste it 2 times. You can see we've got 3 blocks now. And they're directly positioned below one another. That makes them appear as one block. And we want to target that and make sure that they have a little bit of spacing. So instead of using auto for all 4 directions, we use 10px for the first 2 and auto for the second 2. So top and bottom are now 10px and left and right are set to auto. Now we've got separators between our 3 div elements with the class marker. We can move on to step 16. We need different colors. And we can target our marker class by giving them a different class name. But don't just replace it. So get rid of the marker and make it 1. Instead, we want to add 2 classes to the same element. So you can do that as well. We'll keep the marker class and then add our new class 1. Just like this. It just needs a space in between so that it knows that these classes are 2 and they're separated. Step 17. We can remove this background color, and now we won't see our div elements anymore. But we are going to use a background color now for our 1 class, so .1, curly brackets, background color, and then as a value we'll use red. Don't forget the semicolon, And here's our first div. It's back again because this one's the only that has the class 1. Step 19. Now we're going to add the classes 2 and 3 to our second and third divs right here. And in step 20, we're going to target these classes and give them a background color. We'll need green and blue. So you can see our classes have the marker class, which gives them the width, height and margin. But the colors are now different, as 1, 2 and 3 have different background colors. Let's move on to step 21. And we've got many ways to write colors in CSS. And they're all introduced now in the next, like 80 steps. At first we're going to use RGB, which is simply red, green and blue. And these 3 colors are then given a value. And this basically introduces functions in CSS. So RGB and these brackets. This is called a function. And if you get lost with the terminology here, don't worry. It's going to be explained in later courses in freecodecamp, especially when we're going to use JavaScript. For now, just accept that this is a function and understand how you can apply it. And don't worry too much about what a function truly is. We're just going to target our container class and we'll give it the background color property. But instead of using red, blue or any of these values, we use the RGB function and then set these values of the function to 0. And here it is once more explained that RGB is a function now. And these values, so the numbers for red, green and blue, go from 0 to 255. And this is now called an argument. And that's passed on to the function. So let us add this. Instead of writing red, we use RGB and the first letter R stands for red. And we can crank it up to 255 to have it fully red and the other ones are 0. So green and blue are 0, red is 255 and that gives us a red color. We'll do the same for the other classes, but we'll need green, which is the second argument. And for the third div, we'll need the blue to be 255. Step 24. You can see the green looks a little bit different than the one we had before, when we just use green as a value instead of using this RGB function. But if we change the value to 127, we've got the color back. Now we're going to target our container class again, which is the black div. And we're going to adjust the padding so that makes top and bottom look a little bit better. For top and bottom we use 10 pixels. And for right and left we'll make it 0. And we've already used a way of writing this right here for the margin. We'll just write it like this. And the first value now targets top and bottom, the second value 0 targets left and right. Move on to step 26. Now we're going to play around with our RGB a little bit, and we are going to combine primary colors At first we'll set this value back to 255. In step 27, we're going to make all of the colors 255 for the container. And if we have all of them at 255, we're going to get white. So all colors set to 0 gives you black. All of them set to 255 gives you white. Now let's combine only two colors, which will give us secondary colors. We've set the red already to 255, and now we want to do the same for the greens, and this will give us yellow. So red plus green gives us the secondary color yellow. Another secondary color is cyan, and we need green and blue for that. So here it is. Magenta is the third secondary color. We'll need red and blue for that. We can also create tertiary colors. In step 31 we'll do that. And we need to adjust our green color. In this case, I'll make it 127. And we've got orange. So here it is explained why we get orange. So it's just a combination of red and yellow. And we can also combine cyan with green to create spring green, which is also a tertiary color. And looks like this. Another one, which is this. Step 34. We're going to create 3 more tertiary colors. Don't make me pronounce the first one, it's another green. The second one is azure. And the third one is rose. And we can move on to step 35. And we're going to change our colors back to black. And this is 0, 0, 0. Step 36. This one's about contrast, at least a little bit. And contrast is very important for readability. Let us make this red, for example. And we'll make this cyan. And now we'll make the h1 cyan as well, or at least its background. And we use the RGB function once again. We need to know the correct arguments, so the correct numbers for our colors. And if you've gotten lost a little bit, don't worry too much, we've used cyan for our second div, so we just have to find the class for it. And the class was 2. And then we have our RGB values. So we'll need green and blue at 255 to produce cyan. And this is what we need. Step 38. We're going to adjust these colors once more. So we need black, red and black. And there's a very high contrast combination. Step 39. We're just going to make this black again. Step 40. And we'll set this to white. And we can do so by just deleting this code line, as the default is white for this. Step 41. We're going to rename our classes. Let's change one to red. Red isn't defined anywhere in the styles, so our div disappears. And now we'll change the name right here in our CSS, because one doesn't exist anymore, but red does. So .red now targets our new red class. The RGB is for now set to black, we'll change it to red. Step 44, we'll do the same now for our other two classes, and we'll make them green and blue instead of 2 and 3. And in step 45, we'll target these two classes in our styles.css. For now they're both black, but in step 46 we're going to change it, but we're not going to use the RGB anymore. So we can also change colors by using hexadecimal code. Pretty sure you've heard it already somewhere. But if you don't know what it is, it's always the numbers from 0 to 9, so that makes it 10 numbers, and on top of it, it has A to F, so 6 characters. It gives it 16 in total, and that is why the name is hexadecimal. The first two, they'll target the red color, the second two the green color, and the third two the blue color. So it's basically still RGB, so now we're using these 16 characters times 2 for each color instead of 0 to 255. And here it is explained in step 47 a little bit more. So hex colors with 00 are at 0% and FF is at 100%. So basically 00 is now the 0 for the RGB and FF is the 255. You could see it like this. But the positions, they remain, so the first two are always for red, second two for green, and the last two for blue. So if we want to target the green part of this color, we'll need to target the second color combination. In this case that was the FF, and we'll make it 7F. You can also use HSL as a color model, which simply stands for hue, saturation, and lightness. The hue goes from 0 to 360, and the other two are percentages, so from 0 to 100. And you can see this 0 to 360 as a simple circle, where 0 is the start and 360 is the end. And all of the values in between, they cycle through this color circle. Let's just add this HSL function, and we'll pass 3 arguments. And as I've said, don't forget the percentage for the second and third argument. Step 49, we can also add a gradient. And again, it's a function, so just like the RGB, this time the function is called linear gradient. Here it is. And usually you would pair it with the background property. So when we add it right here, we'll need to change our background color to a simple background. In step 50, we are now going to add the linear gradient function. And once you've understood it, it's basically very simple. The first argument is for the direction, and the following arguments, they are for the colors. And you need at least 2 to have a gradient, which is obvious, but you can add as many colors as you want. So instead of the RGB that just has 3 arguments, linear gradients can have more than that. Let us add it. So 90 degrees, which is the direction. And now we would add colors, but in this step we're not adding them, so let me delete that. And we'll move on to step 51. And now we're going to add colors. We could, for example, just pass red, black, these typical colors to it. But we're actually supposed to use RGB. So we're going to use a function within a function. It's also possible in CSS. And we'll make it red, so it's 255 and then 0, 0. For now you still can't see the gradient. As I've said before, it needs at least 2 colors to be visible. Step 52, and now we're going to add the second color. We're going to use RGB once more, and we'll use pure green. So for that we need 0 to 55 and 0 again. And now we can see our gradient. It has a couple of default values. For example, for the position of the colors, let me add a third color. And you can see it's now at position 0, 50%, 100%. And if I get rid of it, you can see it as position 0 and 100. And now we're actually going to add a third color in our next step. So let me do it once again, and you can see the third color right here. Step 54. Color stops are introduced. So as I've said, by default, we've got the position for 3 colors at 0, 50% and 100%. And if we would want to change that, we can use these color stops. So after every color, we can add a percentage to define a position. We'll give it a position 75% for red, and you can see how that has changed it. Step 55. We can also change the direction. For now it's 90 degrees. We'll make it 180. And this is actually the default. We'll set the color stops to 0, 50 and 100. So the default values for these 3 color combinations. Step 57. Now we're going to play around with the colors a little bit. The values are given. We're going to target the first color in this step. Step 58. Now we're going to change the second color right here, which is for now green. And finally, the third color is changed in step 59. Step 60. We're going to change this property as well to background. So it is our second div container with a class marker and green. We're going to add our linear gradient function to it, and this time we're going to use a hexcode instead of RGB. Only one color is given, so we can't see it for now. But when we add the second color, we're going to see it. Step 63. A third color for our gradient. Step 64. And here it is explained once again. I've already mentioned it before. So 0%, 50%, 100% is the default anyway for 3 colors. So we can clean up the code by getting rid of these values. You can see it for the second div. We haven't given it these color stops, and they're still at the exact same position as the first one. Once again, the reason is it's by default 0, 50 and 100% for 3 colors. We can also delete our linear gradient direction, as 180 degrees is the default for it anyway. It's always a good idea to get rid of stuff in your code that you don't really need. The less code there is, the less complex and complicated it is, and it makes it easier to understand. So now our third marker div is targeted, and this time we're going to use the HSL for the linear gradient argument. The values are given. We don't need a direction, we want to have it at 180 degrees anyway, so we can start with the color right away. Our first color, once again, we don't see gradients when they don't have at least 2 colors. In step 68, we're going to add our second color. Step 69, a third color for our gradient. Step 70, we're going to add a new div to our HTML. Let's start with the red marker first, and we want to nest it inside this marker red class div. I will already give it a class sleeve. Don't forget the closing tag. Step 71. We are in our starts.css. And we are going to use the sleeve class as a selector. So .sleeve. Give it a width of 110 pixels and a height of 25. Step 72. We're going to change the background color of this sleeve class to white. And now we can see it right here. We can also use opacity as a property in CSS. So we can make the white opaque by adding it to our sleeve class. At 0.5 it's 50%. Let me make this smaller, and you can see this is our sleeve div that we've created. Step 74. And we want to use an alpha channel instead of opacity, so we can delete this line. It makes it fully white again. But in the next step, we're going to use the alpha channel, and we can add that to the other functions. So instead of just RGB, we'll use rgba. Same goes for HSL, we can use HSLA. And later on, we're also going to add an alpha channel to hexcode. But let's stay here first, so we'll make it white. With the RGB, that was 3 times 255, and we'll add an A value on A argument with 50% to give it this 50% opacity via the alpha channel. So we want to position it a little bit to the right hand side, and we can do that by adding an element before it. We're going to style it afterwards. So it's a new div container, this time it's the class of cap. And we'll need a closing tag. Let's move on to step 77. We'll style our cap. So we use it as a selector, give it a width of 60 pixels and a height of 25 pixels. Now it has vanished, and the reason is we've got these block elements when we use divs. So here's the sleeve, and we can't see it anymore because before it there's the cap, and both want to be in the same line, but the cap comes before it, so it gets the line and the sleeve is pushed below it. To prevent that from happening, we're going to target these classes and add a display of inline block, and that turns these block elements into inline elements. I've forgotten the comma here, so these two classes need to be separated by a comma, and now we can see our marker again, and a cap comes before it in the same line. Step 79. We can also give a border and style it to our div elements. By default, the value for border is none. We're going to specifically target the border on the left and give it a width of 10 pixels first. And there's a little bit of a typo. Now it should be correct. Step 80. Now let's style it. We're still only on the border left. And we'll give it solid as a style. And now we can see it. Step 81. We're back to our sleeve class. And we'll change the color. By default, it should be black and it also looks black, but we'll add it anyway here. And in step 82, we're going to find an easier way to write all of this. So instead of writing 3 lines, we can write it in 1. Let's get rid of the width here. And we can delete these 2 lines, and our border looks the same. Step 83, let's change the style from solid to double. And the browser styles this border now like this. So it's 2 lines now instead of 1. Step 84. And now we'll use the RGB and an alpha channel instead of the color black. So let's change it. Black in RGB was 3 times 0. And for the alpha channel we'll use 75%. Step 85. Let's add our cap and sleeve to the other markers as well, and we can simply copy these 2 divs with the respective classes. And that gives us the result that we want. Step 86. We can also add a shadow. And we use the box shadow property for that. We'll first apply it to our red class, which is the first div, so our markers, so the marker divs. The offset is defined x and y, so x is left to right, y is top to bottom, and then we'll need a color. In this case, we'll just make it red. We can also use negative values for our offset, and that makes it go to the top and to the left. So instead of 5 pixels for each, we'll use -5 for each. So x and y value are now negative, and that makes it go to the top left. Step 88. We can also add a blur radius to our box shadow. It's in between the offset Y and the color. So if we add a value there, we're going to get a blur radius. And we're supposed to give it, 5 pixels. But we're going to add it to the green div element. So it's the second of our markers. So we'll add an entirely new box shadow. 5 pixels each for offset X and Y. Color green, and now the radius. It comes in between the offset Y and the color, and I blurs it a little bit. We can also use a spread radius. It comes in between the blur radius and the color. And we're going to create an entirely new box shadow now for our third marker, which is the blue marker. So let's go over it once again. Box shadow is the property. The first two values are for offset X and Y. And we're going to use 0 pixels in this case. So I'm sorry, let me delete this. You don't have to add pixels to it for 0. 0 doesn't need a unit, but I'm going to add it in this case. So we've got a blur radius of 0 as well, and now we need a spread radius, which is 5 pixels. Step 90. We're going to play around with these values a little bit. It's time for the red marker. So offset X and Y should be 0, blur radius 20 pixels, spread radius should be 0, and the color remains red. And you can see I can get rid of the pixels beside 0, and it's still the same result. Step 91. We're going to get rid of the color red and use rgba for that instead. And the arguments are all given for this function. Let's change the green and blue markers, or their box shadows, in step 92. And again we need offset X and Y to be 0, blur radius 20 pixels, spread radius 0, and we'll leave the colors for now. Step 93, change the color green. This time we're going to use a hexcode. First color for red, 3B, second color for green, 7E, the bluish color to 0. And the alpha channel can also be adjusted in a hexcode. We'll use CC for that. So it's basically the same as here. First 3 are the colors, and the last is for the alpha channel. Step 94. This time we're going to change the blue color and use HSL and the alpha channel. And that's the last step in this course. So that was the third course, building a set of colored markers in this responsive web design blog course. Once again, go through this course yourself and only refer to my walkthrough if you get stuck. I hope this video was helpful, thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.